You turn to Mark 14, 1 through 11. And while you're turning there, I'll just ask you guys some questions to think about as we go through this. So the first is, what is the most valuable thing you own? Now, for a lot of us, it's probably your house or a car or something, but maybe if you're too young to own a house or a car, I was thinking, what is my son's most valuable possession? And I was thinking, it's probably a Lego set. Oh, no, his tablet is cheaper than some of the Lego sets he has. He has some generous aunts and uncles, and he's gotten some big Lego sets. So it's probably be a Lego set. So for some of you, it's not going to be a house or a car. Maybe it's a piece of sports memorabilia that's worth something. Maybe it's something that's really old that's worth something. But figure out what that thing is in your head and just hold it there for a minute. And I'll ask, what would you sell it for? Is there anything that would cause you to sell that thing? I was trying to think of the things for me, and I was like, well, it's probably a house, or maybe it's probably the van. But I was thinking about what other things do I have? And I realized that the things I have are valuable because I think they're valuable. Like, I have this atlas from the 1800s, and it has, like, Prussia is still a country in there, and Austria-Hungary is still in there. And I think it's really cool, but it's kind of fallen apart, and the pages aren't well preserved. It's not worth anything to anybody else, probably, other than to me, because it's cool, and it belonged to someone in my family long ago. But figure out what that valuable thing is, what you would sell it for, and what does that item say about you? What does it say about what you value and where you're putting emphasis in your life? So as you think about that, we're going to be reading this passage, and if you think back a few weeks ago, we were talking about how the rest of the book of Mark is basically going through Holy Week, and we're trying to figure out where each one of these passages falls, and this one is on Spy Wednesday. And if you remember Spy Wednesday, we call it that because it's the day when one of the disciples was doing some espionage, was being a spy, and you'll remember that is Judas. And so let's get into this passage, and we'll start with verse 1, Mark 14. It was 2 days before the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread. The chief priests and the scribes were looking for a cunning way to arrest Jesus and kill him. Not during the festival, they said, so that there won't be a riot among the people. While he was in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper, as he was reclining at the table, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume of pure nard. She broke the jar and poured it on his head. But some were expressing indignation to one another. Why has this perfume been wasted? For this perfume might have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor. And they began to scold her. Jesus replied, "Leave her alone. Why are you bothering her? She has done a noble thing for me. You will always have the poor with you, and you can do what is good for them whenever you want. But you do not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body in advance for burial. Truly I tell you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray Jesus to them. And when they heard this, they were glad and promised to give him money, so he started looking for a good opportunity to betray him. So you might have noticed that there's two things going on here. That Mark will start right at the top, and we're going to talk about the priests and the scribes and the Pharisees, and then we're going to tell this other story about Jesus at the house in Bethany, and then we'll go back to the story about the priests and the Pharisees and the betrayal. And in one of the commentaries I read, and every sermon that I listened to where they covered this, they talked about this as a Markan sandwich, they call it. And they said it as if it's just common and everyone should know what this sandwich is. But thinking back to other passages, you'll think about some of the other sermons we've had, and this has happened before. Well, Mark will introduce a topic, and then he'll say, hold on to that for a minute, let me tell you something else, and then he comes back to it. And this is one of those things, and you'll see, we'll get to it in a minute, why this might matter and why it could be a little interesting for us. But let's start with the first piece of bread, if you will, and maybe it's the bottom or the top. I don't know how we want to call it, but a piece of bread is here, and it is verse 1. It says, "It was 2 days before the Passover and the festival of the unleavened bread. The chief priests and the scribes were looking for a cunning way to arrest Jesus and kill him." So your translation may not say cunning. It may say looking for a stealthy way or a deceitful way. Why do they have to be stealthy about this? Why can't they just go ahead and do it? If Jesus is is committing blasphemy like they say he is, if Jesus is doing these things that are improper, that are indecent, they should just go ahead and arrest him, right? They should just go after him. And verse 2 gives us the answer. Not during the festival, they said, so that there won't be a riot among the people. So normally before Passover, all these people would come for Passover, right? But before Passover, the population of Jerusalem at this time, we think, was roughly 50,000 people. And I know these numbers are hard to visualize. I don't know what that looks like. Well, guess what? You're in luck, because the population of Battle Creek is roughly 52,000 people. So think about as many people as in Battle Creek. That was how many people lived in Jerusalem, just about, we think, during this time. Now, obviously, it was a lot more congested because Jerusalem was a lot smaller, because they didn't have cars and trucks and bikes and motorcycles to get places fast. Like where we are now, and the part of Battle Creek that's over by the mall and Menards and all that would have been two different towns. We wouldn't have been saying, this is all one town, this is all Jerusalem. It wasn't that big. So think about 50,000 people, but squished into a smaller space. And then during Passover, the population jumped up to 250,000 people. So you're already in a city that's pretty busy, that's pretty congested, right? And then you add another 200,000 people on top of that. So as you can imagine, the town would there'd be all kinds of new conflicts, because people are crunched in together, they're trying to go here, but there's traffic. I don't know about you, I get really irritated when there's traffic. When we drive somewhere on a trip and I have to go through a big city, I am on edge. Amen, that's right. When we drove to Florida 2 years ago now, 2 years ago? I don't know. We went down with my parents to go to Florida and took the boys, and I remember driving through Atlanta, and I was just on edge the whole time. I hated it. And so imagine that, but you're just walking and bumping shoulders with everyone. So they didn't want this riot to start, and you may be thinking, well, I've been in traffic, but I've never wanted to start a riot. Well, the Romans who were in Jerusalem and governing over Jerusalem knew there's all these new people in here, so we have to increase our forces. And so they'd bring a bunch more Romans in there. And this would lead to all kinds of conflict. And there were very frequently uprisings that happened around Passover. And one that I read about happened because a Roman soldier who came in, he wasn't normally stationed there, he comes in, he doesn't like the way that the Jewish people are treating him or whatever, so he moons them. And when he does this, everything just explodes and it goes nuts. And there was 4 days of insurrection and violence, and people were being killed because of a very small and insignificant thing. So the priests and the scribes were rightfully saying, we can't go nuts here. We have to be very cautious, very stealthy, because we don't want anything to happen. So that was the top piece of bread, or the bottom piece of bread of our sandwich. I guess bottom, because we build it from the bottom up, right? But so here's the bottom piece of bread. And now we're going to get to our filling, and insert whatever meat and vegetable and cheese and sauce you may like in a sandwich, and that's what we're going to be going to now. So verse 3, a new part of the tale, and he says, while he was in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper, as he was reclining at the table, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume of pure nard. She broke the jar and poured it on his head. So there's a lot of people and places in this passage, in this verse, that we have to figure out, where is he, who is he with, what is pure nard? We don't really know. So he's at the house of Simon the leper. Who is Simon the leper? Well, this is the only time we hear about him. He just puts out there Simon the leper. So he was obviously well enough known that Mark's audience would have been like, oh yeah, we know who that guy was. So some commentators think he was a person that was healed by Jesus, or that he was even possibly Lazarus' uncle or dad. We don't really know, but we do know that he couldn't have possibly had leprosy at the time, because then all the disciples who were coming there and being in that space would have been ceremonially unclean for having come in contact with him. So they wouldn't be able to go to the temple and do any of the Passover activities, because now they are unclean. And then there's this woman, and we wonder, who is this woman? Well, if you bop on over to John chapter 12, John says this in this passage. He says, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus was the one Jesus had raised from the dead. So they gave a dinner for him there. Martha was serving them, and Lazarus was one of those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took a pound of perfume, pure and expensive nard, anointed Jesus' feet, and wiped his feet with her hair. So the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. Okay, so John tells us that this is Mary, Lazarus' sister, the one who earlier, when they were getting busy and doing other things, was just sitting at his feet. And you may be saying, well, wait a minute, John. The first verse we read said it was 2 days before the Passover, and now this one in John says that happened 6 days before the Passover. Which one is it? And I have 2 words for you. Mark, sandwich. Because what Mark is doing is he's saying 2 days before the Passover, the priests and the Pharisees were like, we have to do something about this Jesus. And now I'm telling a completely different story that was not 2 days before the Passover. That was, in fact, 6 days before the Passover. But because I'm Mark, I'm just not going to tell you that. I don't know why. And we don't know why, but we do know that this is the same story being told in John as it is in Mark because of all these similarities. We're going to get to the grumbling that the disciples have, that John talks about, that Mark talks about. Well, the perfume is the same. The location, this house in Bethany, is the same. So let not your heart be troubled. We're not talking about 2 different things. The Bible is not contradicting itself. Mark just has an interesting way of telling stories. I'm sure you've talked to someone before where they'll be telling you a story like, oh, this one time I was with my dad and we went fishing. Oh, but let me tell you first about how my dad learned how to fish. Or like, they go in all these weird directions. And this is what Mark is doing right now. He's like, well, I'm going to tell you about how it came to be that Jesus was betrayed by Judas. Now, let me tell you about a little bit more about that. And then we have to ask, well, what is nard? I've never heard of this. And right, you don't go to Kohl's or Macy's. I don't know where you buy perfume. Whatever place you choose, Sephora is probably a place, Ulta, those places. And you go buy perfume, and I'm guessing you're not going to go and buy some pure nard. They don't probably have that. I've seen enough perfume commercials to know that they name them ridiculous things like intrigue and danger for men or something silly like that. But pure nard is not one of them. So what is nard? So nard is often called spikenard, and it's a plant in the honeysuckle family. So if you ever are running around in the spring and you smell a nice sweet smell, that's honeysuckle probably, oftentimes. And look at it, it's a pretty little plant. And it was it's only found in Nepal, India, and China. And it is expensive and it is rare, especially if you were living in Israel at the time. Because if you think about it, again, they don't have highways, they don't have semis going down the road, they don't have Amazon Prime getting you something the next day. So if you wanted to get something from India, China, Nepal, it would take a long time and it'd be very expensive for someone to get that to you. And oftentimes they were sealed in these alabaster jars, and there's a picture of one now, and it is a jar made out of stone, alabaster. So someone had to carve that out, someone had to smooth it out, make a nice, beautiful jar. Like that on its own is probably worth a lot. And when the perfume was put in there, it was sealed up so none of it would leak out. So you wouldn't lose any of that fragrance. So if you wanted to use it, you got one shot. That's it. You get to use it one time. So this was something that would be passed along from generation to generation because it's that thing that like you have just in case that no one ever wants to use, right? Like we have this little valuable thing that we could sell if we're in a pickle, but we really don't want to sell it. I have my grandfather's rifle from when he was in the Army, and I don't want to ever sell it, but I probably could if I had to someday. And this is the same kind of thing. And so what does Mary do with it? Well, she breaks the jar and dumps it on Jesus. There's no going back, right? It's broken. You can't cork it up again. You can't repair it. You can't use this again. And Mark says that she poured it on Jesus' head, and John says that she anointed his feet with it. And you may say, well, here's a contradiction. And I would challenge you to pour water on your head someday and see, does it end up on your feet perhaps? And the answer is yes, it would end up on your feet. So I don't think there's a contradiction here either. So don't be worried here that she pours it on his head, it goes down here, and then Mary's doing this act of worship, and she's just expressing her love to Jesus. I can imagine that she pours it on her head, and she's just so emotional, and she's on the ground, and then she sees it on his feet, and starts wiping it with her hair, which is weird, but okay, that's an emotional response. I'm not going to go hard on that, but I can't do it anyway. I don't have enough hair. So moving along, we're in verses 4 and 5. But some were expressing indignation to one another. Why has this perfume been wasted? For this perfume might have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor. And they began to scold her. Again, here's a unit that we don't really use. We don't have a denarius in our society, right? We don't say, I'm going to go to Starbucks and I'll get a whatever Frappuccino, and it's 50 denarius. We don't know what that is. So a denarius was one day's wage for your average worker. So 300 is almost a year's salary, right? If you take weekends, which they probably didn't, out of it, but it's 300 denarii. It's a year's salary. Imagine just being an average laborer and saving that much money. It's hard enough to do now. Like most people in our country, they say we're just one medical emergency away from homelessness, right? That most people don't have very much of a cushion anyway. And so I can't imagine saving up as much money as I make in a year and just having that around. I've never been able to do that. And it'd be even harder when you're in a time and a place where you are living just hand to mouth. You're just trying to keep yourself and your family from starving every year. That's the goal. Make it through another year. So saving, that's not a thing. We're not trying to do that right now. So this is extremely valuable. And we ask, well, which disciple was grumbling? And we go back to John, and John says, it was Judas. He says, then one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, and then in parentheses, who was the one who was going to betray him, said, why wasn't the perfume sold for 300 denarii and given up to the poor? So we can say at face value that Judas might have actually a reasonable question, like, she just did something that seems unreasonable, seems not practical. She just dumped all this stuff out. And if we're being honest, a lot of us have this reaction sometimes when we see someone bless somebody else in some way, or we see money being spent, maybe by the church, maybe by a family member, and we see that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Why wouldn't you do X, Y, or Z with it? And so we can at face value look at Judas and say, okay, yep, I get what you're saying. That's if Judas was being genuine and being honest, because John will then say in verse 12:6, he didn't say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. He was in charge of the money bag and would steal part of what was put in it. Judas was a thief. So this whole time, Judas has been skimming off the top, and so if you were saying, I'm going to sell this for almost a whole year's salary, Judas is rubbing his hands together and thinking, ooh, that's a nice payday for me. Because even if he's taking 10%, that's a lot. I'd love to have a 10% bonus someday of 10% of my salary. Yes, please. So Judas is stealing from them, and I have to wonder that this has just been this has to be really hard for him to do because he's with these 12 other guys, him, the other disciples, and Jesus. He's with them all the time. So he can't just show up in fancy new clothes and the coolest sandals that are out there. He can't show up with a brand new chariot or whatever and not have that noticed. They're going to say, Judas, we've been with you the whole time. You weren't working. You weren't making all this money. Where's this coming from? So Judas is hiding this from everyone else. He's sneaking around to do all this. So Judas, he stands to get rich from the sale of nard. He doesn't actually care about the poor. But if you were one of the other disciples and you didn't know he was stealing, this would have seemed like a reasonable thing, because especially during this time, it was customary to remember the poor with gifts during Passover. Much like how in our culture, even people who are not Christians, who celebrate a secularized Santa version of Christmas, they like to go and donate food and donate things to Toys for Tots or whatever during the holiday. And everyone would do this, and we still do this kind of thing. And so Mary does this thing. She's scolded by the disciples. And we can see this in our own lives as well, that sometimes our worshipful, faithful acts might look foolish even to those people who claim to believe in Jesus. And we'll get back there in a little bit. In verse 6, Jesus replies, and he says, leave her alone. Why are you bothering her? She has done a noble thing for me. So the translation I'm working out of is the CSB, Christian Standard Bible. You may be using the ESV or the NIV, and those ones say beautiful or a good act. But notice what your Bible doesn't say. It doesn't say, she's done a practical thing for me. She's done a financially responsible thing for me. She's done the thing that every reasonable person would do for me. It doesn't say any of those things. It says what she's done is beautiful or good or noble. And this is an act of worship that we see kind of going along the theme with what John Johnson's been teaching us in At 9. And I might mess up the tagline a little bit, but he says that worship is this paradox that our most selfless act can be, our most selfless act can be the one that brings us the most fulfillment. That this act of selflessness is in a way a very selfish act because we're going to get something really good out of it by giving away ourselves. This is the beautiful thing that Mary is doing. And Jesus continues on in addressing Judas's concern, and he says, "You always have the poor with you, and you can do what is good for them whenever you want, but you do not always have me." Now, this is a verse that people love to use and abuse for whatever purpose they want. And so some people say it says one thing that Jesus is not saying. So obviously he's responding to the disciples complaining about not using it for the poor. And a lot of people will see this and say, see, Jesus is saying that the poor are always going to be around, so there's no point devoting time, resources, and energy to alleviating that suffering, to alleviating that poverty. And I found more than one occasion when politicians employed this and tried to say, oh, we don't have to fund X, Y, or Z because the poor are always going to be here, so we don't need to do anything about it. That is not what Jesus is saying. That is a perversion of Scripture and is the seed for a whole bunch of other unbiblical ideas that I found when I was doing some research here. A better translation might sound something like this: the poor you will always have with you. Not you always will have the poor with you. The poor you, did I say it twice? I messed up. Anyway, what he's saying is you're always going to be around the poor. Jesus' disciples always had the poor with them. He was traveling around and there were poor people with them all the time. I mean, these guys weren't working for the past 3 years, right? They were relying on the kindness of others. They were poor. Jesus said he doesn't have a place to call his home. He was poor. The poor are always going to be around. And in fact, Jesus, in Luke 4:17 through 21, he kind of talks about why he has come. And he's showing his extreme love for the poor here, his deference for the poor. And he's saying, it says, the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. And unrolling the scroll, he found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." He then rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. And the eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fixed on him. He began by saying to them, "Today, as you listen, the scripture has been fulfilled." In saying that this passage from Isaiah has been fulfilled, Jesus is saying, one of the reasons I came was to proclaim good news to who? To the poor. He could have said to everyone, but he said to the poor. So Jesus is showing he has a special concern for the poor. He's not brushing them off. The point that Jesus is making is, the poor are here with you right now, and so am I. But eventually, I'm going to be killed. I'm going to be buried. I'm going to resurrect. And I'm sure, because he's Jesus and he knows everything, he knows all that's going to happen. And eventually, he's going to go back to the Father, and he's not going to be physically present with them anymore. So there will be a time when Jesus is physically no longer there, and the poor are physically still here. He is not trying to say, so forget about the problems that they have, ignore that, just keep doing whatever. We know that in Revelation, it talks about the final culmination of Christ's kingdom on earth. And we know that finally sin will be dealt with, and because sin will be dealt with, poverty will be no more, inequality will be no more, disease, all these bad things will be no more. So do not see this verse and think, I don't have a responsibility anymore. We as Christians still do have a responsibility to the poor because Jesus loved the poor. Jesus continued in verse 8. He said, "She has done what she could. She has anointed my body in advance for burial." She's done what she could. She's done her best. Jesus doesn't say, oh, she did this little tiny thing for me, and that was okay, I guess, but it could have been more. No, he affirms what she has done. He doesn't say it wasn't enough. And now you may see, she's anointed my body in advance for burial. And I will tell you, this is not typical for people to be anointed before they were dead. You weren't typically waiting around for great Uncle Timmy to pass away and think, well, he's going to go anytime now, so I'm going to make sure he's anointed and ready for his burial. No, there was no need to do this. You were anointed after you were dead. Because if you think about now, when people die, we either cremate them or you'll be embalmed. And when you're embalmed, that's taking the place of the perfuming of the body, right? Embalming is going to preserve the body. It's going to make it not decompose as fast. It's going to prevent your body from stinking, really, when you die. And they didn't have this technology, so they had to do something about the smell. I have a friend who's from Egypt that we met in college, and one summer we were going to go out to Gull Lake to go fishing, and in Kalamazoo you have to go past this big cemetery. It's called Riverview Cemetery. It's huge. And when we were going past it, there's also this like paper mill kind of place around there, and it smells really bad. And so we were driving past, and my friend Rami, he's like, oh, what does that smell? Is that the cemetery? And I looked at him, I was like, cemeteries don't stink. They're just fields with rocks in them, basically. Like, they don't smell bad. And he's like, oh, yes, they do. And it's because in Egypt, where he's from, they don't dig big holes in the ground. It's all rock. There's not a lot of places to dig, so they still put bodies in tombs in little, concrete or stone buildings, and they stack the bodies up in there. And they do smell because it is hot and because the bodies are sitting above the ground. And so he had this idea that, oh, this bad smell is a cemetery. And so if you think, Egypt not far from Israel, where this is happening, if you're putting a body in there, you have to anoint it with something to get the smell down. But this was an act that was not commonly given to criminals, because it says in the Old Testament that cursed is the one who is hung on a tree. That if you get crucified, or if you're hanging from a tree and you die, if you're murdered, if you're in a really violent way, that it was unclean to touch that body. So they weren't anointing those people. And so Jesus is saying, she's doing this in advance, almost acknowledging that he's going to die in a way that is not pleasant, that is not noble, that is a violent criminal's death. Yet again, another prediction he gives of his own death. In verse 9, he continues, he says, truly I tell you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. Did she do anything profound? Not really. She used some really valuable stuff, but the act that she did, she just kind of went like this. It wasn't like some crazy feat. She didn't heal someone. She didn't cast out a demon. But Jesus is saying what she does is going to be remembered. And here's a prophetic experience, a prophetic statement again. Because here we are in the world, in not where she did this, and we are remembering her. She's expressing just humility and thought of herself as nothing, something that Jesus has talked about a couple times. In Mark 9:35, it says, sitting down, he called to the 12, and he said to them, if anyone wants to be first, he must be last and servant of all. In Mark 10:31, Jesus says, but many who are first will be last, and the last first. And he says it more than once, so I would think that Jesus thinks this is kind of important. And we see Mary doing exactly this. She's making less of herself. She has this extremely valuable thing that she could use for her own personal gain. She could sell it and be set for a year. She wouldn't have to do any work. Now, she probably wasn't, because she was a woman in this time. The men were out doing the work, but she could support herself as a woman for a whole year, which is crazy for her. And Jesus is, again, showing his omniscience and his ability to know everything when he says that wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, so there's the assumption that it will be proclaimed in the whole world, which it is being proclaimed in the whole world, and what she has done will be told in memory of her. And here we are talking about her. So that's kind of neat. So that was our meat, cheese, mayonnaise, pickles, whatever of the sandwich, and then we come back to the piece of bread. We're going to put a nice slice right back on top. In verses 10 and 11, Mark continues, and he says, then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray Jesus to them. And when they heard this, they were glad and promised to give him money, so he started looking for a good opportunity to betray him again. So this is because of Judas's desire for money. He seems to be always looking to enrich himself. This is something that we kind of do too, right? There are people who are always looking for the next thing, the next hustle, the next side gig, the next whatever opportunity to enrich ourselves. And Judas also seems to have these expectations of Jesus that don't match up with what Jesus is saying he's going to be here for. And I think this is an experience that we experience too, where we say, Jesus, I really wish that you would heal my friend or whatever. And that doesn't happen. And we think, well, Jesus, you said you were going to heal people, and you didn't heal him. You didn't heal her. What's going on? Or you say, Jesus, there are all these wicked people doing these wicked things. I know you could take care of them. Sodom and Gomorrah is a thing. Noah's flood's a thing. I know you could do it if you really wanted to. And we get disillusioned with Jesus sometimes. As I put the kids to bed at night, I read books on my phone because I have to lay on their floor for a while, and it's hard, and I don't want to fall asleep. Sometimes I do, but sometimes I know Katie wants me to do the dishes, or she wants me to put this away or do that, so I got to stay awake. So I've been reading books on my phone, and I've been reading the autobiography of Dorothy Day, who was a Christian activist during the early part of the 20th century. In the 1900s, she was doing things like trying to get 8-hour work days put in place for people. And she lived in like tenement houses in New York City in the early 1900s and was trying to help people get better living conditions. And she was talking about her faith and the struggles she had in her faith when she saw injustice. And she said in her book, Jesus said, "Blessed are the meek, but I could not be meek at the thought of injustice. I wanted a Lord who would scourge the money changers out of the temple, and I wanted to help all those who raised their hand against oppression." And I saw this quote, and I was like, wow, that's like what Judas is dealing with here, almost. And then some. But like this idea that I see all this bad stuff happening, and I want Jesus to do something about it, and I just don't feel like he is, and so I get disillusioned, and I maybe walk away from the faith, and I think, well, this isn't who Jesus is supposed to be. I have an idea of who Jesus is supposed to be, and he's not living up to it. And Judas is experiencing that along with his greed. He's also saying, we could have sold this and helped the poor. And Jesus is saying, no. And he's like, well, Jesus, you're supposed to help the poor. You're supposed to be the king who comes in on a white horse and not on a donkey. You're the guy who's supposed to throw the Romans out, not sit here and tell us to turn the other cheek and to love our enemies. And so we get to the end of the sandwich, and we have to ask the questions that we've been asking the whole series. First one, who is Jesus? And he's not always who we expect him to be. Judas was expecting him to do different things. We sometimes expect Jesus to do things, and that's not who he is. We expected, the Jews were expecting their Messiah to be a king who rides in and throws off their oppressors violently. And he didn't do that, did he? He rode in, and they killed him, and he let them do it. Peter draws his sword and goes to try and defend Jesus, and we would think, yep, that's like the most justifiable case of violence that we've ever seen, defending God himself. And Jesus says, Peter, cut it out. If you live by the sword, you're going to die by the sword. And he heals the guy's ear, and he's not who we expect him to be. This is going to happen over and over again as we learn more about Jesus, and we say, oh, Jesus, I want you to do this for me, or I want you to do that for me. And Jesus says, I want you to do this for me. You're not in charge of me. What did Jesus do, and what did he say? Well, Jesus accepts and appreciates our acts of worship, even the small ones. And you'll see when it goes up there, I put an asterisk on our acts of worship because I know someone was going to say, well, John, Jesus is not going to accept our human sacrifice. And you are correct. Not every single thing that you deem an act of worship is something that Jesus is going to accept. So within the bounds of typical scriptural teaching, the acts of worship, Jesus is going to accept those things, even small ones. If you think, oh, all I did was sweep up after gather and grow. That's an act of worship that Jesus says is beautiful and it serves him. Jesus said she did what she could. He didn't say she did this big extravagant thing. A lot of times I think we can beat ourselves up and say, well, I'm not the guy who is up here playing guitar. My thing's not visible and exciting, so it's not an act of worship. But if you look back where Jesus is talking about, when you saw me naked, you clothed me. When I was hungry and you gave me food, and when you saw the thirsty and you gave them something to drink, you were worshiping me. You were doing all of this for me. Jesus wants all of our worship, even the little small things. So don't ever think something is too small for the kingdom. Speaking of the kingdom, we ask the question, well, what does this passage tell us about the kingdom? It tells us that the kingdom operates with the poor, that Jesus assumes that the poor will always be in and around the church. When he says the poor you will always have with you, there are always going to be people there. And you may think, well, I am the poor, so how could I be reaching out to the poor? And I'll tell you that, we've heard it a million times in church, but I'm going to say it again, that if you are living in the United States, even if you are poor in the United States, you are rich by the world's standards. And spiritually, if you know Jesus, you are rich. And there are people who are spiritually poor that are around you, that even if they have Jeff Bezos money, they're poor because they don't know Jesus. Another quote I found while looking into some of this stuff was by this Latin American pastor, and he said, to be followers of Jesus requires that Christians walk with and be committed to the poor. When they do, they experience an encounter with the Lord who is simultaneously revealed and hidden in the faces of the poor. That was Gustavo Gutierrez. And he's saying that when you are worshiping Jesus and you are serving people who are less fortunate than yourself, you see You see the mercy of God because you are the one who's bringing good news to the poor. You can bring good news to the poor in your service. You can say, here, let me get you a meal. Let me help you out. Let me do this thing. And also, in doing it, I'm showing you how much Jesus loves you. And he loves you this much, that he loved you enough to die for your sins and that you could be forgiven. So it's not an excuse to do nothing. By being close to the poor, we can share the good news of Jesus and bring the comfort of Christ. Another thing that we learn about the kingdom is that our worship may seem crazy, but we should worship anyway. Was it rational to dump the perfume on Jesus? Probably not, because he wasn't being buried right then, and he wasn't, we could have used that money for something good. It wasn't the rational thing. One more quote for you today from Charles Spurgeon, the prince of preachers himself. And he said, "O brothers and sisters, let us always carry our case into the highest court and live before the Lord, and not as the slaves of men. If we are conscious that we have sincerely done what we have done as unto the Lord, and if we feel sure that he has approved of our service, it is of the smallest consequence possible what men shall say of us." If you're worshiping Jesus and you know that what you are doing is bringing glory to him and you are doing it for Jesus and not for something else, you're not saying, let's give this money to the poor so I can really steal some of it. And you're saying, let's give this money to the poor so that Jesus can be glorified. Then forget about what everybody else has to say about it. If your worship is bringing glory to Jesus and you're just doing everything you can to honor him, it does not matter what people say. That you may say, well, I really feel called to take my family and pick them up and move them across the ocean to some place where they don't know Jesus. And people will say, yeah, but what about the stability of your kid's future? What about their college education? What about their elementary education? What are you going to do? It's not safe. And Spurgeon says, ignore those people. They don't matter. Jesus matters. Just a few, maybe it was a month or two ago that we heard about a couple that went down to Haiti to preach the good news of Jesus to the poor in Haiti, and they were killed. And a lot of people said how insane that they went down to Haiti, one of the most unstable countries in the world. It doesn't make any sense that they would do that. Why would they do that? And I even saw people who were Christians who were like, that was incredibly unwise. And what Jesus says, and I think what Spurgeon is echoing here, is it doesn't matter what those people say. Did the Spirit call you to go and preach the good news to the poor? Then you should do it. Even if it's crazy, even if it's a terrible idea, it's going to put you in the path of warlords and violent gang leaders or whatever. Jesus doesn't say, preach the gospel unless it's dangerous. He says, preach the gospel and bring good news to the poor. And finally, in this passage, we see that knowing about Jesus and loving him are not the same. We have Judas and we have Mary. And Judas has seen all of the crazy miracles that Jesus has done. He's seen him bring Lazarus back to life. He's seen him heal people of leprosy. He's seen him heal people who couldn't walk. He's seen him give sight to the blind. He's seen him raise up Jairus' daughter from the dead. He's seen all of this stuff, and he's even performed miracles in Jesus' name, because Jesus sends the 12 out, right? And they come back and they said, we've performed miracles in your name. We've cast out demons in your name. And Judas was a part of that. Judas saw all of the stuff that Jesus did. He knows all of this stuff, and he still worships himself over Christ. Mary, at minimum, we don't know how long Mary was traveling around with Jesus and all the things she saw him do, but at minimum, she knew that her brother was dead. They stuck him in a tomb. He'd been there for a few days, getting real stanky. They had to keep putting perfume on him. Maybe some of this nard that they had was for that purpose. And she saw Jesus walk to the front of the tomb and said, Lazarus, come out. And she saw her brother, who'd been dead for 3 days, come out. And so you have these two people who've seen the same Jesus. They've seen the same stuff happening. And she decides that she's going to worship Jesus and express her deep love for Jesus. So we kind of have this, I wouldn't say this trap we fall into, but there's this temptation that we can have as Christians that we say, I was raised in the church, or maybe I've studied a lot, I know a lot about Jesus. But I ask you, do you love him? You know a lot about him. Great. Awesome. Has that knowledge of Jesus brought you to the point of loving Jesus? Because even demons know about Jesus, and they still are out doing their demon things. I don't know. They're still being demons. Do you love Jesus? Let us not fall into the trap of thinking that if I have enough knowledge of Jesus up here, that it'll make up for my lack of love for Jesus here. Knowing about Jesus and loving him are not the same thing. And I'm going to add a fourth question to the mix because I thought that we needed to have it, and that is, what does this passage say about ourselves? What does this passage say about us? And I found this helpful, is that sin will not just go away. Feeding it makes it grow. And you may recognize that guy if you were a millennial-ish. Growing up, I was growing up in the 90s, early 2000s. It was like this heyday of Christian media that was out there. And one of those things was VeggieTales. And there was an offshoot of VeggieTales, which was Larry Boy. And if you don't know, he's a cucumber with plungers on his ears, and he's a superhero. And it was great fun. And this guy you see here is the Fib from outer space. And so, quick overview of Larry Boy and the Fib from outer space. There's this Fib who comes from outer space. And he's just around, and people tell these little lies, just a fib, not a big deal. And every lie they tell, the fib grows, and he gets bigger and bigger. And he starts off, and he's like softball size, this little cute little guy. He's no big deal. He's not a big problem. And eventually, he becomes this huge guy who's like Godzilla, like destroying the city. And Larry Boy has to use the power of his plungers and defeat this fib from outer space. And this is that great example of how if we feed our sin, it's going to grow. It may start out, look how cute he is. He's just a little guy. He starts out so cute. And he's going to grow, and he's going to keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger if we feed it. Judas started stealing little bits, just skimming a few denarius off the top. Every time the disciples got money, he'd get a little bit of money here and there. And eventually, he goes all the way to say, I'm so desperate for this money. I'm so greedy. I just need money so badly that I'm willing to betray Jesus to the Pharisees and the scribes. And I'm willing to give up this guy that I say that I love, that I've seen do incredible things, that is God himself, and I'm willing to give him up for 30 pieces of silver, which you may think, that seems like a lot of money. It was the bare minimum amount of money that you could sell a male slave for, was how much 30 pieces of silver was. So he's giving up Jesus, the God of the universe, for nothing, really, for the lowest amount of money you could pay for a slave. So sin doesn't just go away. Feeding it makes it grow. And I'm preaching this not just to you, but to myself too, that we all need to be reminded that any secret sin we have, if we keep that unconfessed, if we don't tell a brother or sister, we don't confess that to the Lord, and we just think we're hiding it, one, you're not hiding it. Jesus can see it. God knows. And two, it's going to grow and grow and grow, and eventually it will consume everything. It'll become a big Godzilla, destroy the city, and we don't have a plunger-eared hero to save us. But we have Jesus, which is even better. So as we digest this sandwich, we get to the end of this and we think about moving on from here. I just want to ask to think back to those things that you thought about at the beginning, that valuable thing you have. Is the Spirit prompting you to do something with that, to offer it to Jesus? Maybe is, maybe isn't. I'm not saying that Jesus is saying to you right now, sell your house. He might, Are you being led to lay down an idol? Are you being led to give up a possession, to use it to serve him in some way? It's really easy in our culture to hang on to stuff and to be stuff-oriented. I got to get more things. I got to go do stuff. I remember going to the store with my mom as a kid, and we'd go down the toy aisle. If we were good, we get to go look at toys, and I'd always want to get something. I'd always want to have another thing. I have a bunch of toys. I want more. Every kid that I know has a bunch of toys, and they always want another toy. They want another toy. They want another toy. As we think about this passage, let's be reminded about the real value of our possessions and what they can be used for. And so I just pray that, I'll pray in a minute here, but I'll pray that as we move from here, that we would be really open to the Spirit's leading in these things, that we would hold all of our things with open hands, and that if God wants them from us, we'll be eager to give them to him, eager to pour out, to break our alabaster jar and pour that nard out for the Lord.